Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of my tutorial series on React Redux and Webpack. In this video we're actually going to start coding, which is really fun. So to get started, you guys can head to the GitHub repo that I set up for this tutorial series, kyberth/react-to-do-list. You can, probably the easiest way to do this would be to fork it to your repository. So make a fork of it, and then you can clone that fork down to your local machine. You can do something like git clone and then the URL to your fork. And then what you're going to want to do is switch to the correct branch. So depending on how far I get and when you're watching this video, there will be a variety of different branches at each different start point for each part of this tutorial series. So right now I only have master and part 3 start, as you can see, but eventually there will be many part 3 starts, and master will likely be the finished product. So for this video, this is part 3. So you're going to want to git checkout part 3 start. I'm already on there, so I'm good to go. Once you've checked out that branch, you can then open it in your favorite editor of choice. For me, it's Sublime, and I have some shortcuts set up to do that. But okay, I'll assume you are all set up and have the part 3 start branch up in your text editor of choice. So I made a very basic repo with not much in it, and I'll start by going through some things. I'm kind of winging this, so hopefully there will be errors, and we'll work through those errors and you'll see kind of the process behind this. I wanted to not include a lot to start because a lot of times it's great to use a starter repo or a starter kit because it has everything working and very fast to get up and running. However, I found that sometimes you lose some of the why or how behind how things are being done in these starter kits. So I wanted to do as much as possible from scratch. If you're familiar with all this, feel free to jump ahead to parts 4, 5, etc. They're not done yet, but they will be. So let's see what to start with. I figured I would open up my package.json. This kind of gives an overview of our app and our project and what's going on. I assume some level of familiarity with NPM and building Node apps, but if you have any specific questions, leave a comment on the YouTube video and I'll get to it and I'll answer it for you. So the beginning of this is pretty standard. I have a name of my app. This is pretty insignificant at this point. We'll get into scripts in a little bit, and this just points to the repository that we're at. Yeah, so here's our dependencies for this section of the tutorial. I think this is all we're going to need for this part. We'll see. You're going to need a few things from Babel. You're going to need Webpack, and you're going to need React and React DOM. So, and Express, because we're going to have a very simple Express server serving our app. Now, if you don't have these already installed, you can go into your terminal and you can do npm install --save. The --save just makes sure that it saves it into the package.json so that if anyone else, yeah, actually, just kidding. You don't have to do the --save. If you're installing each individually, you'd have to do --save, React, React DOM, etc. But actually, since it's already in the package.json, all you have to do is just npm install. As long as you're in the correct directory, so in this case, I'm in my folder called React to-do list right here. It'll look for the package.json and install everything. So yeah, One thing you will have to do, and you can do this right now, is install Webpack globally. We need it locally here in the project. Anything here in the dependencies gets installed into the node modules in the app directory. But Webpack, the way we're going to be using it and displaying it, not displaying it, but demoing it, we'll also need a global version of Webpack installed on your computer. So to do that, you do npm install -g Webpack. And that'll install it into a location like user local bin. And so then you can run Webpack from the command line. So once that's all set up, you should be ready to go to work on this. And I think for right now, I'll go into our simple Express server. So I made a folder called server and added a file called server.js. Now, I'm not going to dive too deeply into how to build an Express server, but basically what we're doing is we're serving static files from the dist folder. I have a dist folder right here. It's empty. Dist meaning distribution. So I'm going to be putting static files in there, and if you remember from the last video, one thing we're always going to want to serve up with our app is the bundle.js. The bundle.js is going to contain all the JavaScript and all of the React components, and so we're going to be, when we build it, we're going to put it into the dist folder, and then our React app will serve it, so that we can reference it from our index.html and load it through a script tag. Lines 8 through 10 here are just saying if we get a request to the root of our website, so like localhost port 3000 / the root, what we want to do is we want to send our client / index.html. Basically, if someone goes to our homepage, we want to send the index.html down. And it looks like I've put it into client folder, and we'll check it out in a minute. The last thing here is what port we want to be listening to for incoming traffic, incoming requests. In this case, it's going to be 3000. And so we actually listen on the port. We throw an error if there's an error. If not, we'll get a nice little log in our console saying the Express server is listening on port 3000. So let's go into client.index/index.html and see what our index looks like right now. Oh, by the way, if the font's too small, just let me know and I can increase it. Just kidding. But you can send a comment maybe if it's really bad, but it should be okay, especially if you go full screen. So this is just a standard HTML file, nothing too fancy. We have a title, very aptly named React to-do list. Here in the body, I have a header tag that says this is not a React app yet. So this header tag has nothing to do with React. It's just HTML. This should show up if our Express server is working correctly and serving up the index.html. Here we have a div with ID app. If you remember from the last video, I talked about having an anchor point so that React can mount all of the components onto the actual page. Generally, you want to mount it onto a div with a unique ID. Very creative name of app. Line 10 here is our script tag, which is going to load our bundle.js. We talked about it last time and a little bit just before. The bundle.js contains all the JavaScript we need to run the React app. So right now, if we run our server, we should be listening on port 3000. And if we go to the root directory, the root page of our server, we should serve up the index. We don't have a bundle.js. We don't have React components yet. I have one here. It's empty. Our dist folder is empty. There's no bundle.js. We're not building anything yet. So all we should get is this header. This is not a React app yet. Before we do that, let me talk about one other thing here. I have a .eslint rc. This is just for Sublime. I have a linter, which means it's a I don't really know exactly how it works, but it goes through your code as you're writing it and makes sure there's no errors or things that it can find that are going to error if you tried to run it. The nice thing about ESLint is you can give it an ESLint file, ESLint RC file, and you can set it up to allow for things like ES6 syntax, which we will be using. And so this is a little bit outside the scope of this talk, but if you're getting weird errors when we're writing either JSX in the React components or ES6, you might want to check out this Sublime linter-ESLint. So the Sublime linter is -ESLint is a plugin that allows you to use ESLint in Sublime. Cool. So if we go back to our code, we want to run this Express app. We want to run server.js. Now, one way to do this is to go to your terminal, and since we're running a Node Express server, we just run the command node and give it the file. Since we're in our folder here, we have to give it the path, which is actually in the server folder and then called server.js. So we go server/server.js, and it says Express server listening on port 3000. Cool. So let's close that. If we go localhost :3000, we get this is not a React app yet. Cool. So it worked. If we go over here, we'll see we've got localhost 3000 and we're serving up our index file. We get this error down here in the console called for the bundle.js, which just doesn't exist. We haven't built the bundle.js, so it's a little bit of an ambiguous error, but basically that's why we're getting that error. Now, running node server/server.js is great, except that if you make a change to server, you're not going to, if you make a change to any of the server code, it's not going to update automatically. So you'd have to cancel it with Control-C, and then you'd have to run it again. But there is something we can do to fix that, and it won't be super obvious here because our server is so simple, we're not really changing much. But I like using nodemon. So if you've never used npm scripts, you should definitely check them out. But npm scripts allow you to run things, kind of save scripts that you want to run on the command line. So I made one called serve, and basically this is just going to run nodemon, and it's going to, nodemon monitors, I call it nodemon, maybe it's nodemon. It monitors your server code, and anytime a file changes, it monitors all of your code actually, and anytime a file changes, it restarts your app, your server. I believe you will need to have nodemon installed globally, just like Webpack up here. So again, to do that, you would just go npm install g nodemon. So because I set this script up called serve, we can just do npm run, and then the name of the script I gave it, which was serve. And this should do a very similar thing. We have nodemon starting up. It's watching the whole folder. The dot just means this current directory. And we gave it server./server.js, so it's running the command node. And it'll restart this command anytime a file changes. If we go back, we should be able to refresh. It's still working. Let's see, what do we want to do next? So let's start building some React components. I have another computer set up, and I have some code I've written in the past, and so at multiple times throughout these tutorials, I'll probably be cheating and looking at it. So if there's a few moments of silence or something along those lines, it's probably just I'm cheating, but I think that's okay. I'll cheat, and by running through everything from scratch, I think it'll help you out a little bit more. So let's go back to our index.html. We have the anchor point that we're going to anchor, and so let's write the code from React that anchors the app. This is kind of like the starting point of a React app. It's where you tell React to render the app onto the actual HTML of the page. Generally, this is done by creating a component that encompasses your entire app. So the function call that is React that's rendering it and anchoring it onto the page is a very simple take this encompassing component, mount it onto the div that has an ID of app. So generally, I like to put this into a client.js file in the same folder as the index.html. And this is kind of the starting point, and then the client is going to reference my overarching component, such as app.js, which we haven't written yet, and then app.js will reference all the other components that make up the app. So for client.js, we're going to need React. And again, you should have run npm install, and so we should have access to React here. Now, you might not, this import syntax is ES6, and so you may not be familiar with it. You may be more familiar with ES5, but ES6 actually has a lot of nice features, and one of them is this import feature. This is the same as saying var react equals require React. These are equivalent. It doesn't seem so much better right now, but we'll get into some cases pretty soon where there's some neat syntax tricks you can use to really simplify your code. Actually, we'll do it right now. So we're also going to need the React library, but we also need a special library from React to render the component onto the actual DOM. Now, React used to have this part of the React library itself, but now it's a separate library from React DOM. So we want to import, and this is the weird syntax, so just hang with me. We want to import the render function from the React DOM library. Now the equivalent of this line is actually var render equals require React DOM dot render. So the React DOM is a large library with a lot of methods. One of those methods is render. And so one way with the ES5 that you could do that is you can just, you want the render method and you want to call it render. So you create a variable named render and you set it equal to this specific method on this whole library which you're importing with the require statement. With the curly brace syntax, you actually you can really save a lot of typing. And the other thing you can do is you can chain methods together. So if there was a method called, I don't know, method 1, I'm pretty bad at making up names on the spot, then we would have access to both the render and method 1, and it would be called render and method 1. So that one line would be the same as this. So it can save quite a bit of typing. The one caveat is that you need to use the same name here that it is in the library itself. Cool. There is no method 1 on React DOM as far as I'm concerned, so let's get rid of that. So that's pretty easy. Then all we have to do is actually call this render function. The render function, we want to render our, let's break this down. We're going to define the encompassing component that we want to mount as the first input to this function, and the second input is the DOM element we want to mount it to. So we haven't written it yet, but the over-encompassing component of our app is going to be this app.js in the components folder. So let's import that. We want to import app from, and it's not a library, but it's a folder, or it's a file. So we give it a relative path to that file. So the double dot goes up a file. So we're currently in client, so we go up into our main folder, React to-do list, and then we go into components, and then we have our app.js. So we now have access to the app. So we are going to use JSX syntax. There's our app component as the first input to this function, and the second input is going to be the element anchor, which we specified with an ID of app. Oops. Let's get rid of our pseudocode. And we should be good to go. Let's save that. Let's see what happens. Again, we haven't written, we haven't written our app yet, but let's see what happens. Oh yeah, so same error. We haven't even done the bundle.js. We haven't built our bundle.js, so clearly nothing's going to happen. Before we do that, let's actually write our app component. Let's see here. Cool. So every component needs the React library, just like the last one did. However, we're also going to use a syntax to just easily pull out the component method of the React library. This allows us to not always have to call react.component. We can just pull it out with the syntax from the React library. There are different ways that you can define a React component. I'm going to use the ES6 class syntax. I'm actually not that strong with it, so I figure it's also practice for me. I think a lot of the React docs and a lot of the Redux docs are written in ES6, so I think it's good to use. And ultimately, you know, it is a little bit of a challenge to always have to translate things, but eventually everything is going to be ES6, and I think you just have to bite the bullet and do it. So anyway, using the class syntax from ES6, we're going to define the app class, and basically it's going to extend the component, the base component from the React library. We're going to define stuff inside of it, like the render function, which is the one function that's needed for every component. We'll do that in a second. And we're going to export the app. Exporting this app allows us to import it here. So as I said, the one thing that every component needs is a render function. And again, the syntax here is ES6 class syntax. Every render function needs to return let's just say returns the JSX. I think everyone should be using JSX, and you can watch my last video for a description about it. But let's just return a div that says this is definitely a React app now. And close the div. Cool. So we have the bare minimum here. This means that when everything is working, we should have a header that says this is not a React app, and then appended, anchored inside this div should be our app, which is going to be this app component. And right now, the only thing this app component has is a div that says this is definitely a React app now. So we're getting close. But again, the bundle.js has not been built. We don't have anything in our dist folder and no way of building it. So that's where Webpack comes in. I mentioned briefly in my last video that Webpack is just a build tool that allows you to go through your app. You'll give it an entry point of this client.js, and it'll say, hey, it needs React, it needs render, it needs, the component app. And then it imports those JavaScript files and builds up a large JavaScript file. It'll then go into, when it says, hey, this one needs app, it goes into app, and if app needs anything like the React library or like another component, which we'll get to in a bit, then it'll go to those files and import that JavaScript and build up the bundle.js. Now, Webpack has some default configurations, but ultimately you'll want to define your own configuration. And generally this is done with a webpack.config.js file, usually put into the root directory. This is going to be just like a large JavaScript object with all your configuration in it. So this is going back to ES5 syntax. I apologize for all this ES5, ES6 crap. But we want to just export a large object with all the configurations in it. So one thing that Webpack wants is an entry. I'm not sure if it has to be an array, but you can have multiple entry points so that it can build up from like multiple points, and we'll actually see how this is really helpful for us in a bit. But right now we only have one, and it's in the root directory where this Webpack file, config file is, and it's in client, and it's at client.js. That's our starting point, right? This is the file where we define our overarching component and we mount it onto the HTML itself. So there's our entry. Webpack is going to go through and build up a file, and we have to tell it where we want that file. Now, if you will remember, in our server file, we are serving up static files from the dist folder. And this means that whenever you look for a file from the main page, so from the index, if you look, you could write this like this, then this is, we're in the dist folder. That's what Express is serving up. So that's where we want the bundle.js folder to be. So we give it a path, and we say we want the path to be dist. Dist stands for distribution, by the way. It actually took me a while to realize that. I just used it because it was seemed standard. We want the file name to be bundle.js. This is also kind of just standard, but you can call it whatever you want. We also define what's called a public path. And to be honest, I get a little confused with how this works, but ultimately this defines kind of that relative aspect. So if you had called public path like public, then in your index you would have had to write public/bundle.js. This will also come in when we learn some more advanced Webpack configuration for your development environment. Sorry about that. But this setup works well for me. Then the meat of your Webpack file is actually what's called module. So this is where you define how you want this is where you define certain things, certain tasks that you'd like Webpack to do while it's bundling. So the entry and the output, no problem. Webpack can bundle all that together, but you might want to do different things. For instance, we've written our app component using JSX. Well, the browser doesn't know what the hell JSX is, so we need to compile that into JavaScript. We also wrote in ES6, and I'm not sure the current status of browsers and their compatibility with ES6, but for all I know, the browser has no idea what the hell to do with ES6. So while Webpack is configuring and building, we want it to kind of compile or do various tasks to certain files, right? So in our module, we define certain loaders. So basically, you're loading a file. You want to do something with it. The loaders is an array. We can have multiple things we want to do for different files. For each type of file, we have an object. So each object has a test property. The test is what files are we doing this on, and this is just regex. So regex is always done between 2 forward slashes. We want to test for .js at the end of the file name. So this test takes the file name and runs it through regex, and if this regex matches, so here we backslash to escape the period, and we say if we see a period.js and it's at the end of the file, that's what the $sign means, then yes, we want to perform this loader on it. So what loader do we want to perform? We're going to use Babel loader. Now, Babel is a whole library, a whole ecosystem of basically compiler tools and compiler plugins, and Babel is actually what compiles the JSX and the ES6 into JavaScript. We'll get a little bit more into this in a moment. We can give it a property of exclude, so we don't want it to go through the node modules folder. So this is, again, regex, and so if we're excluding this whole folder called node modules. Now, Babel is a tool that uses a bunch of different plugins to do different things. So you can use Babel to compile JSX or ES6 or both or other things. So we need to tell Babel what to do. There are 2 ways you can do that. You can add a .babelrc file in your folder, and Babel will look at that and know what plugins and stuff you want to use. The other thing you can do is just use the query property here. So this is exactly the same as setting up a babelrc file. Our query tells Babel what to do for every JS file, which we've defined here. What we want to do is we want to compile JSX to JavaScript, and we also want to compile ES6 to JavaScript. So there are a bunch of plugins that do various different parts of this, but there are also what are called presets. So if you'll remember from our package.json, we actually loaded Babel preset ES 2015, Babel preset React. So the React one will definitely take care of the JSX, and the ES 2015, which is same thing as ES6, will compile ES6 to JavaScript. So in our webpack.config, we can, our query can do presets, take an array, we want React, and we want ES 2015. And that's it for now. So this Webpack config file will tell Webpack what to do. This query will tell Babel what to do, and we're doing everything on JavaScript files that we find. Excuse me. So how do we actually get Webpack to build into this folder? Well, I'll show you kind of a hacky way to do it right now, and in the next video we'll set up a better environment for doing this. But if you'll recall, I told you to to npm install globally Webpack. And if you did that, you should be able to type in which Webpack, and it should give you a path on your computer to the executable, which means that we can then run Webpack from our command line. Now, Webpack can take in a config flag, and the config flag takes in the config file so that Webpack knows what to do. So if we pass in, we're in the right directory, so we actually just need the file name, webpack.config.js. If we hit enter, it should go through our entry point, build all the files, and use the Babel loader to compile it all. And here's the output. It says we now have a bundle.js. Yeah, I don't really know what all this means, but if it had an error, it would come up and it would explain some of what went wrong with the error. So if we go into our folder, we now have a bundle.js. It's probably a huge file. It contains all the React. It contains the React DOM. It contains the Express. Actually, it doesn't contain the Express. But yeah, it contains everything that we found here, and it contains our app. So we now have a bundle in the dist folder. So if we restart our server, the server should serve up this dist folder, and we should now, in our index, we should be able to load bundle.js, and it should mount the app to the anchor point here in the index, and we should see this div say this is definitely a React app now. So let's do npm run serve to run our server. It's listening on port 3000. We can go back, we can refresh, and we get an error. Let's see what's going on here. So we have a warning, react.createElement type should not be null, undefined, boolean, or number. It should be a string for DOM elements, or a React class for composite components. So I'm actually not too sure what this means. I also don't have as good of error handling here, but we can fix that. I guess this is a good time as any to talk about source maps. So part of our Webpack config can actually have what's called a dev tool. And you'll want to run this definitely in your development environment, but probably not in your production environment. There are a variety of options we can give in here, but one is inline source map, which means that instead of seeing an error like this in bundle.js, we see an error that corresponds to the original files. So when Webpack goes through, if you have something set here, it'll keep track of where that code came from in the source, meaning our files. So it's a little bit easier to understand what went wrong. So let's go back. This should have changed, yep. But we have, yeah, so one thing we have to do is we now have to rebuild just a comma. We have to rebuild our Webpack. We rebuild our app. Restart our server. Okay, so again, this isn't too helpful. We get a warning from React. Let's see here. What I'm going to try right now is to not use this class syntax. Not sure this is going to help us out at all, but we need to rebuild. There you go. So, sorry about that. I'm not sorry, but I think it had something to do with the class syntax. I don't know if the syntax was off or if because this was such a simple thing, it didn't work, or we might have needed like a constructor class on it. I'm not entirely positive, so you know what? Let's just go back to the good old ways of doing it. React.create class. Cool. So yeah, that's built. We've got a React app going now. And I think that will be about it for this video. Let's make sure I got rid of that. Now you'll notice here that I keep on having to stop my server, rebuild the Webpack, and then I need to start the server again. So in a future video, probably the next video, maybe the one after, we'll actually learn how to have Webpack automatically rebuild your components anytime they change, and actually it doesn't rebuild the whole thing, it only changes what needs to be changed. Happens really fast and it's really fun. Let's make sure we're still up. So this is definitely a React app now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for part 4.